Go ahead and turn on your camera. Go ahead and turn on your cameras. And Ken, if you want to share your screen.
All right. Okay. Am I sharing my screen?
You are. You're good.
Okay, good. Whoops, how did I get there? I thought I said from the current slide. Excuse me. I got to go back and fix that. Oh, it went back to the top. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about what is poverty and who are the poor. You were asking some questions about that back when we were doing the map activity. And I had one comment or question in the chat that when I was talking about the economic way of thinking, and somebody asked, so if the data is the same, how come there are so many different opinions among economists? Well, I hope that last activity, particularly some of those things in the Kahoot, made you realize that it's very easy for us to look at multiple data points. And lots of times when it seems that economists or anybody else can't agree, it's because of the data points. And when we ask this question about what is poverty and who are the poor, it depends. It depends on what you're looking at. Are you looking at literacy rates? Are you looking at the percentage of the poor who can't read, which is different than the literacy rate because that takes the whole population? Are you looking at what we call per capita GDP? Are we looking at absolute income? What are we looking at? And depends on which data point you pick, could change your opinion. So in answer to that chat question, that's one of the things. And we find that even, you know, if you're listening to the news a lot lately about things like inflation, economic growth, migration, it depends on what data points you're using to form your opinion. So it's a good idea to get lots of data points. So we're going to spend the next few minutes. Debbie, what are I'm aiming for 1050 or 155, 1055, whatever that is, depending on what time zone we're in, right? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these questions and see if we can come up at least with a common definition. And actually, I'll warn you now, we're not going to come up with a common definition, but we at least will understand which data point, which definition of poor are we going to look at if we're going to have any kind of meaningful analysis or discussion. So there's my definition of poor. I came across this picture a few years ago and I thought, you know, that's poor. There's not much discussion, not much doubt about it. If that's the best that person can do for shoes, certainly they must be poor. That doesn't tell me anything about where they live. Doesn't tell me relative to the rest of the world how poor they are. But the picture says to me they're poor. But we need more than that. So first thing, we need to talk about absolute versus relative poverty. We've really been talking about it in many of the answers that you've given, and even in some of the questions that we've asked. Absolute poverty, if we're going to talk about absolute poverty, a measure against a designated minimum threshold of well-being. And we often use an absolute measure of estimated income of people as a threshold for poverty, or excuse me, I should say for poorness. I don't want to say for poverty. And that current standard, which we'll come and talk a little bit more about here in a couple more slides, is the equivalent of $1.90 a day in income. And that's $1.90 PPP, purchasing power parity. So to take out things like exchange rates, inflation, all of that, we've come up with this measure that basically the PPP would say that, and I should know what something costs. Let's say it costs $1.25 to buy a bagel in the United States. What's the equivalent amount of income it would take to buy a bagel in Mozambique? So we try to put it into the purchasing power of that currency. And obviously it's all an estimate, but we do a pretty good job. The World Bank does a lot of work in this area. So we have this absolute poverty threshold of $1.90 a day PPP, and we'll come back and look at it in quite a bit more as we go on. If we want to talk about relative poverty, we're talking about comparing levels of material well-being experienced by different individuals or groups rather than comparing an absolute number. And that, I think, is what leads us to so many of our dots being spread around the world, because what we do is mix these two things. You know, if we go back to my picture, as I said, I don't know where that poor person is. That poor person, as I've identified them by this picture, could be in a country that was only somewhat poor and relatively rich to other countries around it. So then do you say, oh, they're poor, they're not poor? Well, do I want to use absolute or relative? In the United States, we clearly only have a relative poverty problem. We do not have an absolute poverty problem. If you take that standard of $1.90 a day PPP, you would have to look long and hard to find, I think, almost anyone that falls below that standard, particularly if they are accessing social and government programs, both private and government, that are available to them. They may choose not to access them, but I'm saying are available. So when we think about the poor in the United States, we're really thinking about a relative problem. And that's not to downplay it at all. It's a huge relative problem, but it is relative. Whereas when you look at other places around the world, the absolute level of poverty becomes the issue. And in a lot of ways, I think it would be fair to say that the absolute poverty problem is more of a life and death problem than, in most cases, the relative problem. But right away, if we're going to have a discussion about it, or you're going to have a discussion with these students, we begin to see, oh, we better get our terminology straight here about poor and you know, are we talking absolute or relative poverty when we want to talk about a country, about a condition, etc. So a little bit of economic terminology. When we measure what we like to call standard of living, that is, we use our figure of gross domestic product. Our GDP, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, the dollar value of all the goods and services produced in a country in a given year. And we use GDP as an income statistic, even though we're saying there that it is goods and services produced, because the reality is, for everything that was produced, somebody received income, either as wages and salaries, as the owner of the raw materials that went into it, as the owner of the factory or retail space that was leased to a producer, or as the profits that I got as the entrepreneur or speculator, if you will. So we gather that number, and we're pretty good at coming up with those GDP numbers, not only here in the United States, but really around the world. And that becomes our income number. Why do we pick that one? Because it seems to be better than any other one. and we do compare it to other measures of well-being, to standards of healthcare, to literacy, to access to clean water, and it correlates very strongly. And it's a much more, I shouldn't say easy to gather, but less difficult to gather and more clearly substantiated number. Some of the others become more sort of opinion-based numbers than the GDP. It is measurable even in the poorest of countries. Now, when we talk about nominal GDP, we're talking about in current dollars. Real GDP, value adjusted for the purchasing power. And right now we're all too familiar with the difference between nominal and real. You know, if you go to the gas pump, what's the value of a gallon of gas in real dollars, and what's the value adjusted for inflation or purchasing power? Those numbers are different, and we're going to see these inflation numbers continue for a while. But we tend to want to look at what we call a real GDP that is adjusted for that purchasing power or inflation. And then if we take that GDP, that gross domestic product, and divide it by the population, we get a per capita, per person, if you will, average GDP. And that's one of the numbers we often use to measure poverty. Now, that one tends to get used if we're talking about a region or a country. So we go look at the per capita GDP for Somalia versus the per capita GDP for USA, and we take a look and say, wow, the USA seems to be much richer, or we generally say Somalia seems to be much poorer than the United States. And that becomes one of our standard measures of GDP. A little bit more terminology to help us keep straight on these discussions about poor and poverty. When economists talk about income, they're talking about what we call a flow measure. So that's money that flows to and through me in a given time period, usually a year. So for you and I, it's our salary, it's what we get paid and then pay out for all of the goods, services, whatever it is we want to buy. Wealth is considered by the economists what we call a stock measure. That is, it builds up over time. So if FTE pays me to do these kinds of workshops, maybe I did 15 of them last year. Well, let's make it a lot more. Let's say I did 40 of them last year, and I took that money and I bought a new car. I went and bought myself a convertible, and the convertible's out in my garage, paid for. So that's part of my wealth, part of my stock, if you will. And this year, this is the only program they're going to let me do. So I'm not going to get paid very much this year. So my income will be down, but my wealth will not have changed much because the paid for convertible is still in the garage. All right. So it's an important distinction, because when we start measuring poor and poverty around the world, all of the measures we look at use income. They ignore the stock of wealth. They are based on income. Good thing, bad thing, not here to debate that. That's just what we use. And so that's why perhaps a place like Ukraine for a given year could fall very precipitously on the income side, even though there would be some stock of wealth left. So the measures are in income. We've talked about GDP and per capita GDP, and we really default to GDP because it correlates with all those other things that we want to care about the human condition. And so is it perfect? Not by any means. It's the one we use, and that's really, I don't want to defend it. I just want to tell you, it is the one we use. So right now, estimate 657 million people live in extreme poverty. This is from the World Bank. All right, 657 million. I said, where did I say 70? 657 million live in extreme poverty from the World Bank. Now we got this little COVID virus over here that has impacted that number significantly. And we're only guessing over the last 2 years. As you can imagine, this information is almost impossible to pull out at any level of near 100% accuracy. But the estimate is we're at 657, and had it not been for COVID, we'd have been at about 581 million. So COVID has had a significant impact. We think, we certainly know it's had an impact. The estimate is that. Now, this is measured at an absolute standard of $1.90 a day. So we're saying that 657 million people live on less than $1.90 a day. Now, if they live on $2 a day, are they still poor? Certainly by our relative standards, they're still very poor, but they don't get counted as extremely poor. And this World Bank number of the extreme poor is one that we hear and all the time, and one that lots of policy decisions are really based off of. And so get in your minds, that is poor people. If we go back to per capita GDP, that's on average an income, which doesn't say anything about any one of us. You know, if we put together a per capita GDP for this group of people on this Zoom call, we'll get an average income. It very likely would not be the income for any of you. Some of you would be above it, some of you would be below it. So that $1.90 a day, that's just an artificial standard that we drew to say, okay, below that is extreme poverty. But that's not to discount it. It gives us something to compare from year to year, from place to place, and to begin to build policy off of if we want to change that in any way. Now, this started out back, and a few of you are close to as old as I am. We used to hear a lot about $1 a day. And this measure started back in the late 80s. The World Bank took on this task of, all right, how do we identify the extreme poor and what is poor? Very same questions we're asking. And they took individual country measures that were being used as where is your poverty line, and combined those. And some of those even were based on caloric intake, not monetary measures. And they came up with $1 a day was a good representation worldwide. And so clear into the late 90s, the measure of the World Bank was $1 a day. Below that was extreme poverty. Now, they have adjusted that, I think, I know 2, maybe 3 times over the last 10 to 15 years. It went to $1.25. And I can't remember if there was one more stop in there at about $1.70, and now they're using $1.90 as that measure. But so when we hear about poor people in the world, you're likely to hear about the World Bank estimate of it at living below $1.90 a day. And you can see the estimated COVID impact. Now, just is that absolute or relative poverty? I've already answered the question. That's an absolute measure, not a relative one, an absolute. Here are the poverty thresholds in India, China, and the US, just to give you a comparison. Now, ours is, I don't know that I've ever seen it expressed as income per day. Ours is usually expressed as annual income for a family of four. But somebody for me has done the math, so it would come out to $35 a day. China, $2.30 a day. What we got for India, 43 cents a day. That's their official standard of poverty. Right? But the World Bank's is 190. So why should we care about it? Well, take a look here. Now we're back to per capita GDP. So now we're talking about regions and average income. We're not talking about a specific person, but just take a look. In the United States, $76,000 per year per capita GDP. South Sudan, $928. World average, 17,000. So why should I care? Well, maybe you don't. I care. I care that anybody has to live on that kind of income. It helps me understand why you would have shoes on your feet that look like that picture that I started with, in terms of what is poor and what is poverty. But those are the numbers that we're working with. And the question is, back to our map and some of the things you answered for us, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And where has it gotten the most worst? That's probably not correct in English. Where it's poverty increased the most in the last few years, where has it decreased the most? And then if we can identify those places, the big question is why? Why is it increased or why is it decreased? So now let's look at some more data and see what's going on in the world. Here's the great news, and it is great news. The number of extreme poor has declined by about 1.2, almost 1.3 billion since 1981. Well, you sit there and you say, so Ken Leonard, why did you pick 1981? Why didn't you pick 1979, 1990? Why'd you pick 1981? Because we're going to see in a graph in a minute that right around 1980, 1981, for the first time, literally in the history of the world, the number of extreme poor began to decline. There were more poor, extremely poor people every year up till about 1981, and it actually turned downwards. And except for the blip of COVID, has continued downward since 1981. Well, what happened? What's going on that can be possible? And why in our lifetimes, in 1980, some of our lifetimes, in 1981. Now, another thing we run into when you start looking into this, and we've already alluded to it in some of our questions, another way that poverty and poor gets measured is by the percentage of the population living extreme poverty, not the number. I gave you a number, 657 million. This looks at a percentage. And both the World Bank and the United Nations have been morphing toward looking at the percentage of the population in extreme poverty more than looking at the number. In fact, I think if you went on the World Bank site today, at least on their front page, you would only get a percentage of extreme poverty in countries. You sort of have to drill down on that country to find out what that means in the number of people. But up until just a few years ago, that was always published as a head count. And now it's published as a percentage of the population. You can see the progress that we were making here. And they set a goal, and this was back when it was at $1.25 a day instead of $1.90. If you look up there in the right in the gold, they set a goal of getting to 3% of the world living in extreme poverty by 2030. And if you look over there on the left at the progress that was being made, we actually were way ahead of schedule. They were making better progress than was anticipated. And by 2015, all the way down to 9.6. That's going to have to be adjusted because you can see here then how that progress continued to 2018. We're down to 8.6. So still well on our way to hitting that 3% goal. But the estimates with COVID have pushed it back up to 9.1. And now that 2022 is obviously very much a statistical educated guess, since we're still in the middle of 2022. And we don't know, but they guessed at 8.3%. So it probably threw us off the course to hit that 3%. But still making progress. And we honestly don't know yet how impactful COVID pandemic has been on the poor. That's just hard data together. And the reality is, if you look at the World Bank data, their best data tends to come in 5-year chunks. You just can't get this stuff tabulated, collected and tabulated annually every year. So they tend to make their more definitive sort of reports at 5-year increments, but there's where the forecast is. So what's the story there? We're doing amazingly well on world poverty, amazingly well. Big blip over COVID, big blip. And probably for all the things we feel about COVID, you probably magnify those by, I don't know what, 10 or 20. If you are in already in an extreme poverty position in a country with a low per capita GDP, and then COVID hit. And we're just figuring that out. Okay, so where are they? Here is our per capita estimated GDP for 2022 and where those people live. Now, I have to say, I went back and, well, I'll say that later. You can take a look here, that the greenish up there at $25,000, that's per capita income or more. See the United States, you see Australia, you see most of Europe, and then the lighter green is 15 to 25,000, and then the yellow 5 to 15, the kind of orange or rust 1 to 5, and the red under 1,000. This looks an awful lot like the map that you put your dots on, except for some outliers that had us poor in the United States. Certainly your concentration in sub-Saharan Africa and even over in India was right on the money in terms of where the poor are. I'm a little mystified by that region up there north of Russia, north of Europe, at being blue. I don't quite get it because I went and looked, and the data I found says it's lower than the 25, but I will continue to look at that. I just ran into that yesterday as I was kind of going through these slides. So that's where the poor are. So you knew where the poor are. You knew it from whatever you studied, whatever walking around knowledge you picked up. What we didn't know was exactly how's that getting measured. Now we know a little bit more about how that's getting measured. Okay. Some other ways to look at this measurement. This is the number again. Now remember, this is per capita GDP. So it's much, that number is much better for looking at a country or a region in terms of, you know, is this a poor country? Is this a mediumly rich country? Is it a rich country? That per capita GDP. But then we go back on this graph to the number of people in extreme poverty, and they've projected out to 2030, and you can see where they expect them to be. where they have been and where they expect them to be. And probably the most telling piece on here is what's happened since 1990 out to 2015, and that is the fall of extreme poor in South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. That's where the greatest gains have been. There have been gains in sub-Saharan Africa, but the greatest have been in the Pacific and Asia regions, in terms of beginning to answer some of those other questions that we had. So some questions that still remain, even when we look at that data. Why are countries some rich and some poor? I don't know. Can we come up with a hypothesis for that? Why have some countries experienced economic growth and others have not? What factors lead to economic growth? And what does economic growth get you? What can be done to promote economic growth and reduce poverty? Those are the questions that keep some economists, some politicians, and a whole lot of NGO people awake at night. Although it doesn't keep enough of the NGO people awake at night. We'll talk about that later. So the secret to economic growth is in productivity. By productivity, we mean the output produced from a given set of resources in a given period of time. What can we get out of our resources? If we look at economic growth, that is the story of the world. By those resources, we mean human and we mean material, whether it's iron ore, trees, water, hydropower, coal, but very much coming back to humans. How do you increase the amount of output from humans? And if you think about it, how do we increase the amount of output from you? First, we gave you an education, which made you smarter, which meant you could do more and in your chosen profession, do it better. I always think that productivity should have a little parentheses under it or next to it that says quality, because I think it includes quality, though we measure it in units usually. But what else has increased your productivity? Well, you're sitting right in the middle of it. You and I today. What are the chances that Debbie and I could multiply ourselves times 80 across the United States and into Canada while we're both sitting at home and teaching? Our productivity, because of technology, is vastly increased, as is yours. You may not be in a situation where you're teaching people from across the country, but I guarantee there's pieces of technology that have allowed you to actually teach more and better over the last 20 years and 15 years than you did before. So it is that increasing productivity. How do we get more? How do we get more? How do we get more miles to a gallon out of gasoline? How do we get more teaching and quality out of a teacher in 8 hours than we did before? Increasing productivity means that greater output is produced from a given set of resources in a given period of time. If that weren't the case, the world would be much poorer than it is, because we've been using up the resources of the world for centuries. So therefore, we should have been on the downside. We're still very much on the upside because we are getting so much more out of both our human and natural resources. Take a look. Here is a graph that a Nobel Prize winner put together for us a few years ago that looks at the population growth and important world events. Now, the keys here are the population growth along that bottom axis. We've got thousands of years and the population is growing, but not dramatically. And you can see some inventions, some increases of productivity that are coming along that bottom axis. Invention of a plow, first irrigation, beginning of writing, beginning of mathematics. All of those things are productivity increasers. But around 1750, world population takes off. It just goes crazy. And then you begin to see a whole string of inventions to increase our productivity. Why 1750? Anybody want to hazard a guess at why the world population makes that kind of a turn at 1750? Anybody want to jump in there? Harry?
How about industrialization?
Industrialization, but it's really a precursor to some of the industrialization. But yes, that's beginning to hit. I like that answer. Anybody else? Well, I'm going to give you something
Banking.
to what?
Banking.
Banking. Okay, we can add that to it.
Is it agriculture?
Agriculture and the ways we do agriculture.
Medical advancements.
Medical advancements. So now we're talking about productivity. We're talking about quality and some of these other things. We were talking about the institutions, the way we do economics.
Technology in general.
Technology in general. Okay. One of the things that happens around 1750, and the first time I read this, I kind of scratched my head and said, that's nuts. But there are some who want to attribute the change in that curve to the Black Plague. Because the Black Plague forced us into city-states. It was the end of the Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham serfdom kind of approach to life and commerce. It inhibited trade because you were moving from fiefdom to fiefdom. And the Black Plague shrunk the population, particularly of the 18 to 24-year-old males, so much that none of those places could protect themselves alone from other what's ahead of a fiefdom, or worse yet, in Europe, from somebody coming from the East. And so they begin to band together. They begin to change the institutions and establish private property. They had to put political systems in place that helped determine how they would manage each other. And it changed the institutions of Western Europe. We'll talk more about that as we go on. And I'm not going to try to change your thinking there, only put a big enough question mark that you say, oh, I ought to go look at that. But this next graph is pretty interesting because it looks at the estimated per capita GDP of the world. And it looks just like the other graph at the same times or close to it. All right, a fairly flat GDP per capita number across thousands of years, and then suddenly, boom, it takes off, much as this did. Much of that to be attributed to institutions and productivity. We know productivity fosters economic growth, so then the question is, what fosters increases in productivity? And we'll continue to look at that as we go on. All right, how am I doing here? We're okay. All right. So, I can't read what my slide even says. Oh, well. There we go. Economic growth benefits all segments of the economy. And that we'll see. It's when economic growth occurs, it doesn't occur evenly. It doesn't hit everybody the same, but it does hit everybody. Can it mean that there's a wider spread between the rich and the poor? Yes, but it always means that the poor come up, but maybe not at the same rates, the same proportion that others. But it does hit all areas of the economy. So it's not just about the rich getting richer. It's about the human condition improving over time. It's not even. Some people might say it's not fair, but that's not what we're trying to look for here. We're trying to say, how and why does economic growth occur? Whoops, why doesn't my thing want to go forward? Wow. Okay, Debbie, why would I'm stuck. Let's try this. What's
Are you
going
ready
on?
for your video?
Yeah, my PowerPoint just stuck.
Try clicking in it. There you go.
Yeah, but I went back somewhere. Oh, no, I didn't. There we go. So I wanted to bring you back to this slide. Number of extreme poor has declined by 1.28 billion. Think a minute about who that 1.28 billion is. It's the people that were hovering around $1.90 a day. Okay. Bill Gates, he didn't get counted in extreme poor in 1981. He doesn't get counted now, or his father didn't get counted in 1981. Who moved? Who's the 1.28 billion people who moved out of poverty? They were the people in poverty, the poorest of the poor. That's the ones that are moved, that would count in that movement. And so it brings, I mean, it's incredible what we've done for the real poor. It's incredible what we've done for Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. That's incredible too. But a billion people that have moved across that line. Have they moved very far? Some of them very far, others not far at all. So here goes to some of the questions, back to a couple of the questions in the cahoots. This is world poverty, world population in poverty. So this is that percentage of the population that is poor. And you can see it has been dropping. And if we extended that line onto the left, it's been dropping for thousands of years. Okay, that
Can I ask
number.
a quick question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So I was wondering about, you said that they have changed that measurement from $1.25 to $1.70 to $1.90.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, when they changed it from $1.70 to $1.90, did it affect the number of people? They're still making the same amount, but now that's not what qualifies as poor anymore? Because I remember when I was in high school, we changed the level of the poverty threshold in the United States, and they came out, there was a huge headline that was like 1 million more people in poverty. And I was like, and my teacher said, really, that's not true. We just changed the measurement. So is that like included in that?
No, you're correct. As they've moved that number up, it means it has slowed down the number of people that we're saying are out of poverty. If it was still $1 a day, that number would be even smaller. And I choose not to take the time to get into the algorithms of why some people at the World Bank decided it was time to move that up. I'd be okay with if it was still at $1, but the World Bank decided to move that number up for a variety of reasons, and they've gotten better. And there's no use getting into it, because there's factors that go both ways. There's evidence that says that actually a haircut in Mozambique costs way less in real terms than a haircut in the United States. So you start looking at those kinds of things. I will leave it to the experts, because what I want to know is simply to understand which direction we're going and how fast we're going. Hope that helps.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. So the percentage has been going down. And that says that we have, and what do we know intuitively has been happening to the population over the same amount of time? It's been going up. So mathematically, we ought to be losing ground on this, not gaining on it, right? The percentage ought to be, except that a whole bunch of people are doing better and better. And so that says that's a case for, wow, productivity must really have gained over time. We're getting more and more out of our resources. But here's the number that is really so critical in this analysis and so recent. This is the number of people, and this was at the $1 a day. And you can see it had been increasing over time, probably since the beginning of time. And about 1980 and 81, it turns downward and has continued downward, except for the little blip we're in right now with COVID. And we don't know how big that blip is for sure. But this is the key one, that this is finally, we are having less poor people. Forget the percentages. We're having, on an absolute basis, less poor people. Now this one, notice I'm jumping back and forth here, but between numbers of poor and percentages of poor. So when you're looking at this data, when you get all interested and want to go dig through information beyond what we covered today, make sure you think about what you're looking at. This is the share of the world population. So that's the percentage of the world population. And I put this in there simply to show you that that downward trend line has continued and continued at a steeper rate. Over to 2015, this data was available. And then here's an estimate of what happens with COVID, that had you extended that black line as a global poverty rate, that dotted gray line is where we'd have headed by 2021, and the blue and the red are sort of the baseline and the possible of what COVID has done to it. These are all somebody's estimates. We don't have that data, or we have very little data to extrapolate from, but I'll give you some idea where we think we're going. So economic growth does reduce poverty. It improves the lives of the poor by literally making the pie bigger, right? So that the poor are better off. Are they better off relative to the rich? Maybe, maybe not. In some countries they are, in some they aren't. But that's not today's lesson. That's another lesson. This one is, how do you get people out of poverty? You grow the economy, and it's a bigger pie. And even if they're getting about the same percentage of the pie, they are better off. Economic growth raises standards of living, even in the continuing face of scarcity. Growth does not eliminate scarcity. It doesn't eliminate. Everything's as scarce as it was, but it may attenuate it because some things become less scarce. And because of productivity, we get so much more out of both humans and materials. It's not even across time and country. It's not automatic. And as we've seen in recent years in places like you were identifying, of Venezuela, Brazil, Zimbabwe, it is not irreversible. Those countries who have gotten rich can get poor if they don't pay attention to what they're doing. It is the most powerful weapon against poverty that we've found. All right, how are we doing? Oh, we're doing well. I want to show you a little video. This is a video, some of you may have seen this. It's been around, it's on YouTube by Hans Rosling. Unfortunately, Hans is now deceased, so we're not going to get another video like this. You're going to find this one only goes to 2010 in terms of the data he looks at, but I think visually it's so impactful, it's still worth looking at. So we're going to take about 10 minutes and watch this video if technical Ken is good enough to make it play. Everybody seeing it all right? Yes?
We don't hear your sound, Ken. Go ahead and pause the video. And then up in your
Yeah, where is that?
share settings, you've got to click share computer sound.
Where are my share settings? You are sharing?
You could also just do new share.
Oops, lost that. Oh my.
When you do share screen this time, when you pick the window, at the bottom of the white screen, there's a little checkbox you can check that says share sound.
The bottom?
See the white screen where you're selecting which screen you want to share? Bottom left, there's a little checkbox, share sound. Do you see it?
Nope. Let's see. Bottom left and optimize for
No,
video.
don't click optimize. Don't click that.
Okay.
Yeah, just do share sound.
Okay. So now we should work.
Yep. Click play
And-
and
and I-
restart
Yeah.
at the beginning.
Good? Okay.
Yep.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you have seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay, I want to go back here if I can and
20,000 numbers.
show you one thing. Are you hearing me? Yes, no, yes. Okay. Right here, if I can pause this.
Well, what you have seen.
It's important based on the data that we've been looking at to remember the size of those bubbles. Because when we take in that $1.90 a day, we're taking in all the bubbles. When we look at per capita GDP, we're looking at individual bubbles. And when you look at the red bubbles there and how big those are relative to most of the others, particularly ones at the top, you can see, just like we saw on your maps and on the maps I showed you, the real gains against poverty have been in China and India, as those red bubbles move from way down there in that left-hand quadrant to up into reasonable areas. That's where the gains have been. So Rosalind figured out how to make this much more entertaining than I ever have. And I wish he could do it again, but he sort of can. And that I want to go, let's see, can I, that doesn't happen.
In the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown.
All right, how do I get out of this, Debbie? Help.
Over 200 years and beyond.
You can just escape out of your slideshow.
120,000.
Will that take me back? No,
You want to go to a web browser and show them Gapminder?
no, I just want to
Oh.
show them a screen. I want to just go back to my presentation.
Slideshow? Okay, you're in it. Click on to the left of the video.
Oh, to
There
the
you go.
left of it.
There you go.
Okay, there's a website that the organization he started working with has continued called Gapminder. And I took a couple of screenshots. I probably, yeah, in retrospect, I should have gone live. So this is what he had on his screen, 2010. And take a look at where those bubbles are. And I'd say, look at that green one out there to the right as sort of a point of reference. And now look at 2020. And you can see that everything has continued to move upward and to the right. And you can see that those big bubbles, those big red bubbles, continue to make the biggest moves. Now, if you go to Gapminder, you actually can just move the date bar along there and watch this move. I just took a screenshot at two different places on there to show you. So, and there is a number of ways that you can organize the data they've got if you want and take a look. So it's a great site to watch the trend lines in this information. And as I said, more entertaining certainly in this video. That video must have taken a lot to do because nobody else has attempted to do it that I've seen. They've gone to flat screens. But that to be said, all right. So, oh, there it is, Gapminder or Gapminder tools. Whoops, I thought I had one more slide. I don't. So we're ready
Go back.
for lunch, right?
Go back
How
one
much?
slide. Go back
Go-
one slide, Ken, just to the, For the person in the chat that was mentioning, I'm going to share this with my AP human geography, teacher friends. Notice on the bottom, on the X and Y axes, it's a drop down menu, and you can actually change the variables to any indicator of human well-being that you can imagine. Life expectancy, number of teeth at different ages that people have, access to, clean water, healthcare, education. There's all kinds of variables, and you can pick what you want on the X and Y axis, and you can play it over time and see how those things have changed for all the different countries. So it's a great resource, no matter what social science that you're teaching. So we're going to take a break. We will see you back here as scheduled at 2:25, or fill in the blank if you're in other time zones. So whatever the hour, 25 after the hour, we'll see you back here for after the lunch break for the next part of the program. So feel free to stay connected, just mute your cameras and microphones, and we'll see you after the break.